Harold spent his last $60 on a pregnant mare everyone told him to let die, with only 60 days left before the bank seized 4 generations of family land. What that horse delivered in the freezing barn that January night made a 30-year veterinarian stumble backward and whisper that he had never seen anything like it. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun cast long shadows across the withered fields of Harold Mitchell's farm, a place that had once been a symbol of prosperity in the small town of Cedar Creek, Kentucky. Now, in the autumn of his 62nd year, Harold stood at the edge of his property, watching the last of his cattle being loaded onto a truck bound for the auction house. Each animal that disappeared into that metal container took with it another piece of his heart, another fragment of the legacy his grandfather had built nearly a century ago. The farm that had sustained 4 generations of Mitchells was dying, and Harold felt its death in his bones like a slow, creeping frost that nothing could thaw. The drought had come first, 3 consecutive summers of relentless heat that turned his pastures to dust and his crops to brittle memories of what they once were. Then came the medical bills when his wife Eleanor suffered a stroke, followed by the mounting debts that accumulated like snowdrifts against a barn door. The bank had given him until the end of winter to make his payments or face foreclosure. 3 months, 90 days to save 100 years of family history. Harold knew the numbers better than he knew his own reflection, and those numbers spelled out a single, devastating word: impossible. His neighbor, Thomas Walker, had stopped by that morning with the news about the livestock auction in Millbrook, some 40 miles east. There was talk of a breeder who had fallen on hard times, worse even than Harold, and was selling off everything he owned at rock-bottom prices. Harold had almost dismissed the idea entirely, for what use did a man with no money have for more animals he could not afford to feed? But something in Thomas's voice, a peculiar insistence that bordered on urgency, made him reconsider. "Sometimes, Harold," Thomas had said, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder, "the Lord works in ways that don't make sense until you're looking back at them. You've got $60 in your pocket and nothing left to lose. Maybe that's exactly enough." The drive to Millbrook felt longer than it should have, the old pickup truck groaning with each mile as if it, too, had grown weary of fighting against the inevitable. Harold passed farmhouses and fields, some thriving and others abandoned, and he wondered how many other men like him were out there, watching their dreams crumble into dust. When he finally arrived at the auction grounds, the sight that greeted him was one of organized chaos. Trucks and trailers parked in haphazard rows, the sound of animals calling out in confusion, and people milling about with expressions that ranged from hopeful to heartbroken. Harold wandered through the crowds, his worn boots kicking up small clouds of dirt as he moved from pen to pen. There were cattle and pigs, goats and chickens, all manner of livestock being sold to the highest bidder. But none of it interested him. He had come here on a whim, following an instinct he could not name, and as the minutes passed, he began to wonder if that instinct had been nothing more than the desperate grasping of a drowning man. It was then that he saw her. In a far corner of the auction grounds, separated from the rest of the animals as if she had been forgotten, stood a chestnut mare with a coat that had lost its luster and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. Her belly was swollen with pregnancy, heavy and low, suggesting she was close to her time. A handwritten sign hung crookedly on her pen: "Mare, pregnant, $60 or best offer, as is." Harold approached slowly, drawn by something he could not explain, and the mare lifted her head to watch him come. "Poor thing's been here for hours," said a voice behind him. Harold turned to find an old man in overalls, his face creased with lines that spoke of decades under the sun. Nobody wants a pregnant mare these days. Too much trouble, too much risk. The fellow who owned her lost everything in a fire last month. Had to sell her and the others just to keep food on his table. The old man shook his head sadly. It's a hard world for farmers these days. Harold turned back to the mare, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. There was something in her eyes, a spark that had not yet been extinguished, despite whatever hardships she had endured. It reminded Harold of his own reflection in the mirror each morning, that stubborn refusal to surrender, even when surrender seemed like the only sensible option. He reached into his pocket and felt the crumpled bills there, the last $60 to his name after paying for gas to get here. His mind told him this was foolish, that buying a pregnant horse he could not afford to feed was the final act of a man who had lost all sense of reason. But his heart, his tired and battered heart, spoke a different language entirely. "I'll take her," Harold heard himself say, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. The old man raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, simply nodding toward the auction office where the paperwork could be completed. An hour later, Harold found himself loading the mare into his trailer, speaking to her in soft, reassuring tones as she hesitated at the ramp. "Easy now, girl. I know you've been through a lot, but I promise you this. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." The mare seemed to consider his words, her large brown eyes searching his face for something, and then, as if reaching a decision, she stepped forward into the trailer. The drive home was quieter than the journey out, the weight of what Harold had done settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had spent his last dollars on a horse that might not survive the winter, whose foal might not survive the birth, and all because of a feeling he could not explain. Eleanor would think he had lost his mind. Perhaps he had. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror at the mare standing calmly in the trailer, her breath misting in the cooling air, Harold felt something he had not felt in a very long time. It was small and fragile, easily crushed by the harsh realities waiting for him back home, but it was unmistakably there, burning like a single candle in an endless night. It was hope. Eleanor was sitting on the porch when Harold pulled up the long gravel driveway, her wheelchair positioned to catch the last warmth of the afternoon sun. Even from a distance, Harold could see her expression shift from curiosity to confusion as she noticed the trailer hitched to the back of his truck. She had not fully recovered from her stroke, and though her mind remained as sharp as ever, the right side of her body had betrayed her, leaving her dependent on the wheelchair and on Harold's tireless care. As he parked the truck and stepped out, she called to him with the strength she could still muster in her voice. "Harold Mitchell, what in the name of heaven have you brought home?" There was no anger in her tone, only the bewildered affection of a woman who had spent 43 years married to a man she still did not fully understand. Harold walked to her side and knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her hand in both of his, as he had done so many times before, when he needed to confess something difficult. "A horse," he said simply. "A pregnant mare. I bought her at the auction in Millbrook." He paused, searching for the words to explain what he himself did not fully comprehend. "I know it doesn't make sense, Ellie. I know we can't afford another mouth to feed. But when I saw her standing there, alone and forgotten, something told me I was supposed to bring her home. I can't explain it any better than that." Eleanor studied her husband's face for a long moment, reading the lines and creases she knew better than her own. She had seen him through good times and bad, through harvests that overflowed and droughts that left them with nothing. She had watched him bury his parents, raise their children, and fight against every hardship that life had thrown their way. In all those years, she had learned to trust his instincts, even when they defied logic. There was a reason Harold had survived when so many others had failed, and that reason lived somewhere in the depths of his heart, in a place where faith and stubbornness intertwined. "Well then," she said finally, a small smile crossing her lips, "I suppose you'd better introduce me to her." Harold helped Eleanor into the truck, and together they drove the short distance to the barn, where he had already decided the mare would stay. The structure was old, but solid, built by Harold's grandfather from timber, harvested on the very land it stood upon. Most of the stalls were empty now, ghosts of the horses and cattle that had once filled them with life and purpose. But one stall had been freshly bedded with straw, prepared with what little Harold had left, and it was here that he led the mare when she stepped cautiously down from the trailer. The horse moved slowly, her pregnant belly making each step a careful negotiation with gravity. Harold guided her with gentle hands and softer words, and when she finally stood in the center of the stall, she turned to face him with an expression that seemed almost grateful. Eleanor watched from her wheelchair at the entrance, her eyes glistening with tears she did not bother to hide. "She's beautiful, Harold," she whispered, "tired and worn down, but beautiful all the same." "Like all of us," Harold replied, running his hand along the mare's neck. "She just needs someone to believe in her." That night, after Eleanor had gone to sleep, Harold returned to the barn with a lantern and a bucket of water. The mare was lying in the straw, her sides rising and falling with the steady rhythm of rest. He sat down on an overturned crate near her stall and simply watched her, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the weathered walls. "I don't know what's going to happen," he said softly, speaking to her as if she could understand every word. "I don't know how we're going to make it through the winter, or how I'm going to pay the bank, or what kind of future any of us have. But I made you a promise today, and I intend to keep it." The mare opened one eye and regarded him with a calm intelligence that Harold found both comforting and unsettling. It was as if she knew things he did not, secrets about the future that she was keeping close to her chest until the proper time to reveal them. He thought about asking her what those secrets were, but the notion seemed absurd, even in the privacy of an empty barn at midnight. Instead, he simply sat with her, sharing the silence and the darkness, two wounded souls finding solace in each other's company. The days that followed were challenging in ways Harold had anticipated and ways he had not. Feed was expensive, and with winter approaching, the prices only climbed higher. He sold off what little he had left, an old tractor that had not run in years, some tools his father had collected, a few pieces of furniture Eleanor agreed they could live without. Each sale bought them a little more time, a few more bags of grain, a few more bales of hay. But the debts continued to mount, and the bank's deadline loomed ever closer, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Through it all, Harold cared for the mare with a devotion that surprised even himself. He groomed her coat until it began to regain some of its former shine. He walked her around the pasture when the weather permitted, building her strength for the birth that would come any day now. He named her Grace, because that was what she had given him, a grace he did not deserve and could not explain, but accepted all the same. The veterinarian, Dr. Samuel Perkins, came by once to examine her and left shaking his head in wonder. "This mare has been through the ringer," he told Harold. "Malnutrition, stress, you name it. By all rights, she shouldn't be as healthy as she is. But something's keeping her going, something stronger than anything I can prescribe." He looked at Harold with an expression that bordered on reverence. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Harold did not know what he was doing. Not really. He was simply loving her, the way he had loved everything he had ever been given responsibility for. his land, his animals, his wife, his children. It was the only thing he knew how to do, and it had never felt like a choice so much as a calling. Grace seemed to sense this, and her trust in him grew deeper with each passing day. She would nicker softly when she heard his footsteps approaching the barn, and she would rest her head against his chest when he stood beside her, as if drawing strength from his heartbeat. Winter arrived in Cedar Creek with a ferocity that caught even the most seasoned farmers off guard. The first snow fell in early December, a gentle dusting that painted the fields white and made the world look clean and new. But within days, that gentle snow had given way to blizzards that howled across the land like hungry wolves, piling drifts against barns and houses and turning roads into impassable rivers of ice. Harold spent his mornings shoveling paths from the house to the barn, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, his muscles aching with an exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. The cold was relentless, seeping through the cracks in the farmhouse walls and settling into the bones of everyone and everything it touched. Eleanor felt it most acutely, her weakened body struggling to maintain warmth, despite the blankets Harold piled upon her, and the fire he kept burning day and night. The heating bills added another weight to their already crushing burden, but Harold refused to let his wife suffer more than she already had. He would sooner freeze himself than watch her shiver. Grace, too, felt the winter's bite, though she bore it with the stoic resilience that Harold had come to admire in her. He had insulated her stall as best he could, stuffing old blankets and newspapers into the gaps between the boards, and he had purchased a heat lamp with money he did not have to keep the worst of the cold at bay. Each morning, when he entered the barn with her feed, she would greet him with a soft whinny and a nuzzle that warmed him more than any fire could. Their bond had grown into something profound, a silent understanding between two beings who had both stared into the abyss and refused to blink. The letter from the bank arrived 3 days before Christmas, delivered by a postal worker who could not meet Harold's eyes as he handed it over. Harold already knew what it contained, but reading the words made them painfully real. 60 days. That was all the time they had left before the foreclosure process would begin. 60 days to find $30,000 they did not have and had no way of obtaining. Harold read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. He did not show it to Eleanor. She had enough to worry about without adding this final confirmation of their doom. That night, Harold sat in the barn with Grace as he had done so many nights before, the lantern casting its warm glow against the darkness outside. The mare was restless, shifting her weight from side to side, her belly so swollen now that the Harold marveled she could move at all. Dr. Perkins had estimated she would give birth sometime in the next 2 weeks, and Harold found himself praying that the foal would come healthy and strong. It seemed like such a small thing to hope for in the face of everything else, but it was all he had left. "You know, girl," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "my grandfather used to say that God never closes a door without opening a window. I've spent my whole life believing that, trusting that there's a plan even when I can't see it. But I'll be honest with you, Grace. Right now, I can't see any windows. All I see are walls closing in from every side." Grace turned her head toward him, her dark eyes reflecting the lantern light like 2 pools of liquid amber. She stepped closer and rested her muzzle against his shoulder, breathing warm air onto his neck. It was a gesture of comfort, of solidarity, and Harold felt his eyes sting with tears he had been holding back for months. He wrapped his arms around her neck and held on, allowing himself a moment of weakness in the presence of the only being who would not judge him for it. The town of Cedar Creek had always been a close-knit community, the kind of place where neighbors helped neighbors, and no one was ever truly alone. But hard times had a way of turning people inward, of making them guard what little they had against the uncertainty of tomorrow. Harold had noticed the change over the past few years, the way conversations grew shorter and smiles grew rarer, the way people looked past each other rather than at each other. The drought had taken more than crops and livestock. It had taken something from the soul of the town itself. Still, there were those who remembered the old ways, who refused to let hardship turn them into strangers. Thomas Walker was one such person, and he arrived at Harold's farm on Christmas Eve with a truck bed full of hay bales and a determination that would not be denied. "Don't you dare argue with me," he said before Harold could even open his mouth. "I've got more hay than my animals can eat, and it'll just go to waste if I don't find somewhere to put it. You'd be doing me a favor by taking it off my hands." Harold knew it was a lie, a kindness dressed up as practicality, but he accepted it with a gratitude that words could not express. The two men unloaded the hay in silence, working side by side as they had done countless times over the years. And when the last bale was stacked in the barn, Thomas placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. "We're all pulling for you, Harold. The whole town is. Whatever happens, you need to know that you're not alone in this." That night, Harold and Eleanor shared a modest Christmas dinner. Canned soup and bread. Simple fare that tasted like a feast because they were sharing it together. Eleanor had insisted on decorating a small tree that Harold had cut from the woods behind their property, and its twinkling lights filled the room with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. They did not speak of the letter from the bank or the uncertain future that awaited them. Instead, they spoke of Christmases past, of their children who had grown and moved away, of memories that no foreclosure could ever take from them. Later, as Eleanor slept peacefully in her bed, Harold made his way to the barn one final time. Grace was lying in the straw, her breathing deep and rhythmic, her body at rest even as the life within her prepared for its entrance into the world. Harold knelt beside her and placed his hand on her belly, feeling the movement beneath. "Merry Christmas, Grace," he whispered, "and Merry Christmas to you too, little one, whoever you are." The new year arrived without fanfare, slipping into Cedar Creek under a blanket of gray clouds and frozen silence. Harold marked its passage with a quiet acknowledgement, a simple nod to the calendar hanging in the kitchen before returning to the endless work that consumed his days. There was wood to chop and snow to clear, animals to feed and a wife to care for, and beneath it all, the constant drumbeat of worry that had become the soundtrack of his existence. 53 days remained until the bank's deadline, and each sunrise brought that number down by one, a countdown to catastrophe that Harold could not stop no matter how hard he tried. Grace had grown enormous in the final weeks of her pregnancy, her belly so distended that she moved with the careful deliberation of a ship navigating treacherous waters. Harold watched her constantly, alert for any sign that labor might be beginning, and he had taken to sleeping in the barn on a makeshift cot so he would be present when the moment finally arrived. The cold seeped through the blankets and into his aging bones, but he bore it without complaint. He had made a promise to this horse, and he intended to keep it even if it cost him his own comfort. Dr. Perkins stopped by every few days to check on Grace's progress, his experienced hands pressing gently against her sides as he assessed the position of the foal. "Any day now," he said during his most recent visit, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air of the barn. "She's carrying low, which is a good sign. The foal has dropped into position for birth." He paused, his expression growing thoughtful. "You know, Harold, I've been a veterinarian for over 30 years, and I've seen plenty of pregnant mares in my time. But there's something different about this one. Something I can't quite put my finger on." Harold nodded, understanding exactly what the doctor meant, even if neither of them could articulate it. There was an energy surrounding Grace, a quiet intensity that seemed to fill the barn with anticipation. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something extraordinary to happen. Harold felt it in his gut, that same instinct that had driven him to buy her in the first place. And he trusted it now as completely as he had trusted it then. Eleanor insisted on being brought to the barn to see Grace whenever this weather permitted, and Harold would bundle her in blankets and wheel her carefully across the snow-packed ground. The mare seemed to recognize Eleanor, greeting her with soft sounds and gentle nudges that made the older woman laugh with delight. "She knows," Eleanor said one afternoon, her voice filled with wonder. "She knows we're all in this together, doesn't she? That whatever happens to one of us happens to all of us." Harold looked at his wife, at the woman who had stood by his side through every trial and triumph, and felt his heart swell with a love that time had only deepened. "I think she does," he replied. "I think she's known it from the very beginning." The community continued to rally around the Mitchell family in small but meaningful ways. Casseroles appeared on their doorstep, left by anonymous benefactors who wanted to help, but did not want to embarrass. Feed and supplies materialized in their barn, gifts from neighbors who claimed they had simply purchased too much for their own needs. The local church took up a collection, and though the amount was modest, it represented a sacrifice that Harold understood all too well. These people had so little themselves, yet they gave what they could without hesitation or expectation of return. One evening, as Harold sat with Grace in the fading light, his daughter called from California. Sarah had been the first of their children to leave Cedar Creek, drawn by opportunities that the small town could not provide. And she had built a successful life for herself in a world that seemed impossibly far away. They spoke of ordinary things at first: the weather, her work, the grandchildren Harold had only seen in photographs. But eventually, the conversation turned to the farm, to the situation that everyone knew about but no one wanted to address directly. "Dad, I've been talking to Michael and Rebecca," Sarah said, referring to her siblings. "We want to help. We've pooled together some money and it's not much, but maybe it can buy you some more time with the bank." Harold closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the generosity of his children and simultaneously crushed by the knowledge that their sacrifice would not be enough. The amount they could offer, combined with everything else, still fell far short of what was needed. "I appreciate that more than you know," Harold replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I need you to understand something. Whatever happens to this farm, it doesn't change who we are or what we mean to each other. This land, these buildings, they're just things. The real legacy your grandfather left us isn't made of wood and soil. It's made of love and faith, and the stubborn refusal to give up, even when giving up would be easier." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Harold could hear his daughter crying softly. "I just wish there was more we could do," she whispered. "I wish I could fix this for you." "Some things can't be fixed," Harold said gently. "They can only be endured. And enduring is something our family has always known how to do." After the call ended, Harold returned to Grace's stall and sat beside her in the darkness. The mare was awake, her eyes gleaming in the dim light, and she watched him with an expression that seemed almost knowing. Harold reached out and stroked her mane, feeling the coarse hair beneath his calloused fingers. "It's going to be okay," he told her, though he was not sure if he was speaking to her or to himself. "Somehow, some way, it's going to be okay." Grace nickered softly in response, and Harold chose to interpret it as agreement. Outside, The wind howled against the barn walls, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the uncaring moon. But inside, in this small pocket of warmth and connection, there was peace. Whatever tomorrow brought, Harold knew he would face it the same way he had faced everything else in his life. With faith, with determination, and with the quiet certainty that giving up was never an option. The night of January 15th began like any other winter night on the Mitchell farm, with howling winds and temperatures that plunged well below freezing. Harold had finished his evening chores and was preparing to settle onto his cot in the barn when he noticed something different about Grace. The mare was pacing in her stall, moving in tight circles with an agitation that immediately set Harold's instincts on high alert. Her ears were pinned back, and she kept looking at her flanks, twisting her neck around as if trying to understand what was happening inside her own body. Harold approached her slowly, speaking in the calm, measured tones he had learned to use when animals were distressed. "Easy, girl. Easy now. Is it time? Is tonight the night?" Grace responded with a low groan, a sound that seemed to come from deep within her chest, and Harold knew with sudden certainty that the moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. His heart began to race, but he forced himself to remain calm. Panic would help no one, least of all Grace. He called Dr. Perkins immediately, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed the number he had memorized weeks ago. The veterinarian answered on the third ring, his voice groggy with sleep, but sharpening quickly as Harold explained the situation. "I'm on my way," Dr. Perkins said. "Keep her calm and keep her moving if she wants to move. Don't try to force anything. Mares have been giving birth for thousands of years without our help. Our job is just to be there in case something goes wrong." The next hour felt like an eternity. Grace continued to pace, her breathing growing heavier and more labored as the contractions intensified. Harold stayed by her side, talking to her constantly, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of sensations that must have been overwhelming her. He told her about the farm, about his grandfather who had built this barn with his own two hands, about the generations of animals that had been born within these walls. He told her about Eleanor, about their children, about the life they had built together through decades of hard work and harder times. "You're not alone in this," he repeated again and again, the words becoming a mantra. "Whatever happens, you're not alone." Dr. Perkins arrived just as Grace finally lay down in the straw, her body committing fully to the process of birth. The veterinarian moved quickly but quietly, examining the mare with practiced efficiency, while Harold held her head and continued his soft stream of reassurances. "Everything looks good, Doctor," Perkins reported. "The foal is positioned correctly. Now we just wait and let nature take its course." The waiting was the hardest part. Harold knelt in the straw beside Grace, his knees aching and his back protesting, but he refused to move from her side. He could see the effort each contraction cost her, the way her muscles strained and her breath came in sharp gasps. It reminded him of Eleanor giving birth to their children, of those long nights in hospital rooms when he had felt so helpless, able to do nothing but hold her hand and pray. This felt the same, that mixture of awe and terror that accompanied the miracle of new life entering the world. And then, just as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the barn walls, something emerged. Harold watched with wide eyes as a small wet form slid into the straw, followed almost immediately by another. He blinked, certain that exhaustion was playing tricks on his vision. But when he looked again, the image remained the same. There were two foals lying in the straw, two tiny bodies struggling to take their first breaths of cold Kentucky air. "Twins," Dr. Perkins breathed, his voice hushed with amazement. "Good Lord, Harold, she's had twins." Harold stared at the newborn foals, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. Twin births in horses were extraordinarily rare. He knew that much. Most twin pregnancies ended in tragedy, with one or both foals dying before or shortly after birth. The odds of two healthy twins surviving were so slim that most breeders did not even dare to hope for such an outcome. Yet here they were, two perfect foals, their chests rising and falling with the rhythm of life. But Dr. Perkins was not finished expressing his astonishment. He moved closer to the foals, examining them with an intensity that bordered on disbelief. "Harold," he said slowly, his voice trembling slightly. "Look at these markings. Look at the coloring." Harold forced himself to focus, to see past his exhaustion and his overwhelming emotion. The first foal was a deep chestnut like its mother, with a white blaze running down its face and 4 white socks that gleamed against its darker coat. It was beautiful, the kind of horse that would turn heads wherever it went. But it was the second foal that made Harold's breath catch in his throat. This one was pure white, not the cream color of a palomino, or the gray that would darken with age, but true white, with a coat that seemed to glow in the early morning light. Its eyes, when they opened for the first time, were a piercing blue that Harold had never seen in a horse before. "What does this mean?" Harold asked, unable to tear his gaze away from the white foal. Dr. Perkins shook his head slowly, his expression one of wonder mixed with uncertainty. "I've been a veterinarian for over 3 decades, and I have never seen anything like this. A white foal with blue eyes born as a twin to a healthy chestnut? The genetic odds against this are astronomical. This isn't just rare, Harold. This is once in a lifetime. Maybe once in several lifetimes." Grace lifted her head weakly, looking at her newborn offspring with the tender exhaustion of new motherhood. She nickered softly, and both foals responded by struggling to rise on their wobbly legs, drawn by instinct toward their mother's warmth and the promise of her milk. Harold watched them take their first uncertain steps, falling and rising and falling again, but never giving up. It was, he thought, a perfect metaphor for life itself. "They're fighters," Harold whispered, "just like their mother." News of the twin foals spread through Cedar Creek like wildfire, carried on the tongues of neighbors, and amplified by the astonishment that accompanied each retelling. By noon, on the day of the birth, Harold's phone had rung so many times that he had stopped counting, and by evening, a steady stream of visitors had begun arriving at the farm to see the miracle with their own eyes. They came bearing gifts of food and supplies, their faces alight with a wonder that Harold found both touching and slightly overwhelming. For a man who had grown accustomed to solitude and struggle, this sudden outpouring of attention was as disorienting as it was welcome. Thomas Walker was among the first to arrive, his pickup truck kicking up clouds of snow as it barreled down the driveway. He burst into the barn with the enthusiasm of a man half his age, his eyes going wide when they fell upon the 2 foals nestled against their mother in the straw. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, removing his hat in an unconscious gesture of reverence. "Harold, do you have any idea what you've got here? Any idea at all?" Harold shook his head slowly, still too exhausted and emotional to fully grasp the significance of what had occurred. He had been awake for over 30 hours, sustained only by adrenaline and the coffee that Eleanor had insisted he drink despite his protests. "I know they're rare," he said. "Dr. Perkins told me that much. But beyond that, I'm afraid I'm in the dark." Thomas let out a low whistle, circling the stall to get a better look at the white foal with the blue eyes. "Rare doesn't begin to cover it, my friend. A true white horse with blue eyes? That's not just rare. That's the kind of thing people write legends about. And twins on top of that? Harold, there are breeders who would give their right arm to own an animal like this. We're talking about serious money here, life-changing money. The words hit Harold like a physical blow, staggering him with their implications. He had been so focused on the immediate miracle of the birth, on the simple joy of seeing Grace and her foals alive and healthy, that he had not stopped to consider the financial dimensions of what had happened. But now, as Thomas's words sank in, he felt something shift inside him, a door opening onto a possibility he had not dared to imagine. "How much?" Harold asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How much are we talking about?" Thomas shrugged, but his eyes were gleaming. "Hard to say without knowing more about the bloodlines. But if that white foal is what I think it is, if it's truly a genetic anomaly of the kind that only appears once in a generation, then you could be looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. You'd need to get experts involved, have the foals properly evaluated and documented. But Harold, I'm telling you, this could be the answer to everything." Harold sank onto a hay bale, his legs suddenly unable to support him. The number Thomas had mentioned seemed impossibly large, a figure from a dream rather than from the harsh reality of his daily existence. He thought about the letter from the bank sitting in his kitchen drawer, about the $30,000 that had seemed as unattainable as the moon. Could it be possible? Could this strange twist of fate, this decision to buy a forgotten mare at a roadside auction, actually save everything he had spent his life building? Eleanor had to be told. Harold helped her into her wheelchair and brought her to the barn, watching her face as she took in the sight of Grace and her twin foals for the first time. The joy that spread across her features was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and when she began to cry, Harold knew they were tears of happiness rather than sorrow. "Oh, Harold," she said, reaching out to grasp his hand. "Oh, my dear Harold, look what you've done." "I didn't do anything," Harold protested gently. "This was all Grace. All I did was give her a chance." Eleanor shook her head, her grip tightening on his fingers. "No, you did so much more than that. You believed when believing seemed foolish. You hoped when hope seemed lost. That's not nothing, Harold. That's everything." Over the following days, the farm became a hub of activity, unlike anything it had seen in years. Dr. Perkins returned with colleagues from the State Agricultural College, experts in equine genetics who examined the foals with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. They took samples and measurements, photographs and videos, their excitement growing with each new discovery. The white foal, which Harold had begun calling Miracle, was indeed a genetic rarity of the highest order, a perfect storm of recessive genes that had combined to produce something the experts had only read about in textbooks. "This animal is extraordinary," one of the geneticists told Harold, her voice trembling with barely contained enthusiasm. "The combination of true white coloring, blue eyes, and apparent perfect health is virtually unheard of. Most white horses have some underlying genetic issues, but preliminary tests suggest that Miracle is completely sound. If that holds true, you're looking at an animal that could revolutionize breeding programs across the country." The chestnut foal, which Eleanor had named Hope, was also generating significant interest. Though less visually striking than its sibling, Hope displayed a conformation and temperament that the experts described as exceptional. Together, the twins represented a genetic treasure that breeders would compete fiercely to access. Inquiries began pouring in from across the nation, from horse farms and research institutions, from wealthy collectors and passionate enthusiasts. Each call brought new offers, each offer larger than the last. Harold navigated this sudden interest with the cautious wisdom of a man who had learned to distrust easy solutions. He consulted with lawyers and accountants, with friends and family, determined to make decisions that would protect not only his immediate financial needs, but also the long-term welfare of Grace and her foals. These animals had saved him, and he would not repay that gift by selling them into situations where they might be exploited or mistreated. "We do this right," he told Eleanor one evening, "or we don't do it at all." The weeks following the birth transformed the Mitchell farm in ways that Harold could never have anticipated. Where once there had been silence and decay, now there was life and purpose, a constant flow of visitors and phone calls that kept Harold busier than he had been in years. The media had caught wind of the story, and journalists from local newspapers and television stations began requesting interviews, eager to share the tale of the bankrupt farmer and his miracle foals. Harold, who had never sought attention and did not particularly enjoy it, agreed to speak with them only because he understood that publicity could help ensure the best possible future for Grace and her offspring. The story resonated with people in ways that Harold had not expected. In a world filled with bad news and broken dreams, the tale of a man who had risked his last $60 on a forgotten horse and been rewarded with a miracle struck a chord that transcended geography and circumstance. Letters began arriving at the farm, handwritten notes from strangers who had been moved by Harold's story and wanted to share their own experiences of hope and redemption. Some included small donations, $5 or $10 tucked into envelopes with messages of encouragement. Others simply expressed gratitude for the reminder that sometimes, against all odds, good things could still happen. Harold read every letter, often with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He had not realized how much his story could mean to others, how the simple act of refusing to give up could inspire people he had never met and would likely never know. It humbled him in ways he could not articulate, this unexpected role as a symbol of perseverance. He was just a farmer, he kept telling himself, just an ordinary man who had made an ordinary decision. But perhaps that was precisely the point. Perhaps the most extraordinary things in life grew from the most ordinary seeds. The offers for miracle continued to escalate, reaching figures that made Harold's head spin. A breeder from Texas offered $300,000 for the white foal, a sum that would have seemed like fantasy just weeks ago. A research institution in California proposed an even larger amount, promising to use Miracle's unique genetics to advance scientific understanding while ensuring the animal's comfort and welfare. A wealthy collector from Dubai sent a representative with a blank check and instructions to secure the purchase at any cost. Each offer was carefully considered, each potential buyer thoroughly investigated. But it was an offer from a small breeding farm in Virginia that ultimately captured Harold's attention. The farm was owned by a woman named Margaret Chen, a former corporate executive who had left the business world to pursue her lifelong passion for horses. Her operation was modest compared to some of the other interested parties, but her reputation was impeccable. She bred horses not for profit, but for love, selecting each animal with care and treating them as family members rather than commodities. When Harold spoke with her on the phone, he heard in her voice the same reverence for these creatures that lived in his own heart. "I won't pretend I can match the other offers you've received," Margaret told him honestly. "I don't have that kind of money, and even if I did, I wouldn't spend it. Horses aren't investments to me, Mr. Mitchell. They're partners. They're friends. What I can promise you is that if you choose to sell Miracle to me, she will be loved and cared for every single day of her life. She will never be pushed beyond her limits or treated as a commodity. She will have pastures to run in and companions to share them with. She will have a home, Harold listened to her words and felt something settle in his chest, a rightness that he had learned to recognize over his many years of making difficult decisions. The larger offers would solve his problems more completely, would provide security not just for himself and Eleanor, but for their children and grandchildren as well. But money had never been what drove Harold Mitchell. What drove him was something deeper, something that could not be measured in dollars and cents. "Tell me more about your farm," he said, and Margaret did. They talked for over 2 hours that first night, and many more hours over the nights that followed. Harold learned about Margaret's journey from the corporate boardroom to the rolling hills of Virginia, about the horses she had rescued and rehabilitated, about her vision for a breeding program that prioritized health and temperament over flashy pedigrees. The more he learned, the more certain he became that this was where Miracle belonged. Not because it was the most lucrative option, but because it was the right one. The negotiations that followed were conducted with a fairness and transparency that reflected both parties' values. Margaret offered $150,000 for Miracle, along with a lifetime visitation agreement that would allow Harold and Eleanor to see to the foal whenever they wished. She also proposed a partnership arrangement for any future offspring, ensuring that the Mitchell family would continue to benefit from Miracle's genetic legacy for years to come. It was less than half of what the highest bidders had offered, but it was more than enough to save the farm and provide a cushion against future hardships. Hope, the chestnut foal, would remain at the Mitchell farm. Harold had never seriously considered selling both twins, and Eleanor had made it clear that at least one of Grace's offspring needed to stay where it had been born. Hope would grow up in the same barn where generations of Mitchell animals had lived, carrying forward a legacy that had nearly been lost forever. In time, perhaps, Hope would have foals of her own, and those foals would have foals, and the line would continue unbroken into a future that Harold could finally imagine without fear. The day Harold signed the papers that would transfer Miracle to Margaret's care was bittersweet in ways he had anticipated. He stood in the barn with Grace and her twins, watching them interact with the easy affection that had developed over the weeks since their birth. Miracle nuzzled against her mother's neck, while Hope pranced nearby, already displaying the spirited personality that would define her character. It was a scene of perfect contentment, and Harold committed it to memory, knowing that soon it would exist only in his heart. The morning Margaret Chen arrived to collect Miracle dawned cold and clear, the kind of winter day that made the Kentucky landscape look like a painting rendered in shades of white and gray. Harold had been awake since before sunrise, sitting in the barn with Grace and her twins, savoring these final hours before the separation that he knew was necessary, but still dreaded. He spoke to Miracle in soft tones, telling her about the life that awaited her in Virginia, about the green pastures and gentle hands that would care for her. Whether the young foal understood his words, Harold could not say, but she listened with the attentive stillness that had characterized her from the moment of her birth. Margaret arrived in a gleaming horse trailer pulled by a truck that had clearly seen better days, a contradiction that Harold found immediately endearing. She was smaller than he had imagined from their phone conversations, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth. When she stepped out of the truck and approached Harold with an extended hand, he felt the last of his reservations melt away. This was a person who understood what truly mattered, who valued substance over appearance and character over convenience. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her grip firm and sincere, "it's an honor to finally meet you in person. I've thought about this moment every day since we first spoke." "Please," Harold replied, "call me Harold, and the honor is mine. Thank you for giving Miracle a home, where I know she'll be loved." They walked to the barn together, and Harold watched Margaret's face as she laid eyes on the white foal for the first time. The wonder that transformed her features was unmistakable, a reverence that went beyond the animal's monetary value to something purer and more profound. She approached Miracle slowly, allowing the foal to smell her hand and become accustomed to her presence before attempting any contact. When she finally stroked Miracle's gleaming coat, tears glistened in her eyes. "She's even more beautiful than I imagined," Margaret whispered. "Thank you, Harold. Thank you for trusting me with her." The loading process took longer than expected, not because Miracle was difficult, but because Harold kept finding reasons to delay the inevitable. He checked and rechecked the trailer's safety features, asked Margaret repeated questions about the journey, and made unnecessary adjustments to the travel blanket that would keep Miracle warm during the drive. Eleanor, who had insisted on being present for the farewell, finally placed her hand on his arm and spoke the words he needed to hear. "It's time, Harold. Let her go." Harold nodded, his throat too tight for speech. He led Miracle to the trailer one final time, his hand resting on her neck as they walked. At the base of the ramp, he stopped and turned to face her, looking into those remarkable blue eyes that had captivated everyone who saw them. "You be good now," he said, his voice cracking despite his efforts to control it. "You show them what you're made of, and remember where you came from, you hear? Remember that you started your life in a broken-down barn on a broken-down farm, and you turned everything around." Miracle nuzzled his chest, her warm breath penetrating the fabric of his coat, and Harold allowed himself one last embrace before stepping aside. Margaret led the foal up the ramp with gentle competence, securing her in the trailer with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this countless times before. When the door closed, Harold felt something inside him close as well, a chapter ending even as a new one began. He stood in the driveway with Eleanor, watching the trailer disappear down the road until it was nothing but a speck on the horizon. Then it was gone entirely, and the silence that remained felt both empty and full, a paradox that Harold did not try to understand. He simply accepted it, the way he had learned to accept so many things over his long life. The check from Margaret arrived 3 days later, a piece of paper that represented more money than Harold had ever held in his hands. He deposited it immediately, and within a week, he was sitting across a desk from the same bank officer who had sent him the foreclosure notice. The man's expression as Harold handed over a cashier's check for the full amount owed was something Harold would treasure for the rest of his days. It was a mixture of surprise, respect, and something that might have been shame, though Harold chose not to dwell on that last emotion. "This clears your debt entirely," the bank officer said, his voice subdued. "The foreclosure proceedings will be terminated immediately. The farm is yours, Mr. Mitchell. Free and clear." Harold nodded, accepting the receipt that confirmed the transaction. He did not gloat or make pointed comments about the bank's earlier lack of mercy. Such behavior was beneath him, and besides, he understood that the officer was simply doing his job, following rules established by people far removed from the realities of rural life. What mattered was that the farm was saved, that the land his grandfather had worked and his father had tended and he himself had loved would remain in the Mitchell family for at least one more generation. The news spread quickly through Cedar Creek, and the celebrations that followed were unlike anything the town had seen in years. Neighbors who had watched the Mitchells struggle now rejoiced in their salvation, organizing a community gathering that filled the Mitchell farm with laughter and music and the aromas of homemade food. People came from miles around, some who had known Harold his entire life, and others who knew him only from the stories they had heard. They came to congratulate him, to thank him for reminding them that miracles still happened, and to share in the joy that had been absent from their community for far too long. Harold moved through the crowd with Eleanor by his side, accepting handshakes and embraces, his heart full to bursting with gratitude. He saw Thomas Walker raising a glass in his direction and returned the gesture with a smile. He saw Dr. Perkins deep in conversation with some of the university geneticists, no doubt discussing the scientific implications of Miracle's birth. He saw children running between the adults' legs, their laughter rising into the winter air like music. And in the barn, away from the noise and celebration, Grace stood quietly with Hope, mother and daughter together, in the place where everything had changed. Spring arrived in Cedar Creek with a gentleness that felt like forgiveness, the harsh winter gradually releasing its grip on the land as temperatures climbed and the frozen earth began to thaw. Harold watched the transformation from his usual spot on the farmhouse porch, marveling at the way life reasserted itself after months of dormancy. Green shoots pushed through the brown soil. Birds returned to build their nests in the old oak trees, and the pastures that had seemed so barren slowly carpeted themselves in fresh grass. It was a resurrection he had witnessed countless times over his decades on this land, but never before had it carried such profound personal significance. The farm itself was undergoing its own resurrection. With the burden of debt lifted and some money remaining from the sale of Miracle, Harold had begun making repairs that had been postponed for years. The barn received a new roof, its weathered shingles replaced with sturdy materials that would withstand another generation of Kentucky storms. Fences were mended, equipment was serviced, and the farmhouse itself received attention that Eleanor had long requested, but never demanded. Harold took satisfaction in each improvement, not because he cared about appearances, but because these repairs represented a commitment to the future, a declaration that the Mitchell farm would endure. Grace and Hope thrived in the warming weather, spending long hours in the pasture that Harold had designated specifically for their use. He would often pause in his work to watch them, the mother and daughter moving together with an ease that spoke of deep connection. Hope had grown remarkably in the months since her birth, her chestnut coat gleaming with health and her legs carrying her in increasingly confident strides. She had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's unknown spirit, a combination that made her both a joy and, occasionally, a challenge to manage. Margaret Chen called regularly with updates on Miracle, and each conversation filled Harold with a warmth that lingered long after the phone was returned to its cradle. The white foal had adapted beautifully to her new home, forming bonds with the other horses on Margaret's farm, while maintaining the unique personality that had distinguished her from birth. Margaret sent photographs and videos, documenting Miracle's growth and development with the dedication of a proud parent. Harold printed his favorites and displayed them on the refrigerator, a gallery of moments that connected him to the animal he had helped bring into the world. Eleanor's health, too, showed improvement as the stress of their financial situation faded into memory. The stroke had left permanent limitations, and she would likely never walk unassisted again, but her spirit had rebounded with remarkable resilience. She spent her days on the porch, when weather permitted, watching the farm come back to life, and offering commentary that ranged from practical suggestions to gentle teasing. Harold cherished these moments with her, recognizing them as gifts that he had nearly lost in the darkness of the previous year. Their children visited more frequently now, drawn by the farm's transformation and the desire to witness what their father had accomplished. Sarah flew in from California with her family, and for the first time in years, the farmhouse echoed with the sounds of grandchildren playing in rooms that had grown too quiet. Michael and Rebecca came together, siblings who had drifted apart reconnecting over shared meals and shared memories. The family that had been scattered by time and distance began to find its way back to each other, drawn by the gravity of home and the recognition that some things were worth preserving. One afternoon in late April, Harold took his granddaughter Emma to meet Grace and Hope. The little girl, just 7 years old, approached the horses with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded Harold of himself at that age. He lifted her onto the fence rail and stood beside her, one hand on her back for safety, as she reached out tentatively toward Hope. "Is she nice?" Emma asked, her voice small but curious. "She's very nice," Harold assured her, "but you have to be gentle with her. Horses can sense how you're feeling, so if you're calm and kind, she'll be calm and kind right back." Hope approached the fence slowly, her nostrils flaring as she investigated this new small human. When she was close enough, she extended her neck and allowed Emma to touch her face, standing perfectly still as the child's fingers explored her soft muzzle. The wonder that bloomed on Emma's face was a reflection of the wonder Harold had felt the night Hope was born. That sense of encountering something magical, in a world that too often seemed devoid of magic. "Grandpa," Emma said, her eyes never leaving Hope, "can I come back and see her again?" "You can come back whenever you want," Harold replied, his heart swelling with emotions he could barely contain. "This farm will always be here for you. That's a promise." The legacy Harold had feared losing was not just land and buildings, he realized. It was moments like this one, connections between generations that linked the past to the future in an unbroken chain of love and memory. His grandfather had lifted him onto a fence rail just like this one, introducing him to horses that had seemed impossibly large and wonderful. Now he was doing the same for his granddaughter, passing down not just knowledge, but something deeper, something that could not be measured or sold or taken away by any bank. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Harold walked Emma back to the farmhouse where the rest of the family was preparing dinner. The sounds of conversation and laughter drifted through the open windows, a symphony of belonging that filled the evening air. Harold paused at the door and looked back toward the barn, toward Grace and Hope standing together in the golden light of dusk. He thought about the auction in Millbrook, about the moment he had first seen Grace standing alone and forgotten in that dusty corner. He thought about the $60 in his pocket and the voice inside him that had insisted, against all reason, that he was supposed to bring her home. He thought about the miracle that had followed, the twin foals that had changed everything, and the chain of events that had led to this moment of peace and plenty. "Thank you," he whispered into the fading light. Whether he was speaking to Grace, to God, or to the universe itself, he could not say. Perhaps it did not matter. What mattered was that he meant it with every fiber of his being. 5 years passed like water flowing over smooth stones, each season bringing its own rhythms and revelations to the Mitchell farm. Harold, now 67 years old, moved a little slower than he once had, his joints protesting the decades of labor they had endured. But his eyes remained sharp, and his spirit remained strong, sustained by the daily miracles that surrounded him on land that had been in his family for over a century. The farm that had nearly been lost to foreclosure had become something more than a place of agriculture. It had become a sanctuary, a living testament to the power of faith and perseverance. Grace had aged gracefully into her senior years, her chestnut coat now flecked with gray around the muzzle and eyes. She spent her days in peaceful retirement, wandering the pastures with the unhurried contentment of an animal who knew she was loved. Harold visited her every morning without fail, bringing treats and spending quiet moments in her company. Their bond had only deepened with time, evolving from the desperate hope of their first meeting into something that resembled old friendship. When Harold spoke to her now, he did so not out of need, but out of gratitude, acknowledging all that she had given him. Hope had grown into a magnificent mare, her beauty and temperament attracting attention from breeders across the region. Harold had received numerous offers to purchase her over the years, some quite substantial, but he had declined them all without hesitation. Hope was not for sale, she was family, as much a part of the Mitchell legacy as the land itself. When she gave birth to her first foal, a spirited colt with his mother's coloring and his grandmother's intelligent eyes, Harold wept openly in the barn, overwhelmed by the continuation of a line he had once feared would end with him. Margaret Chen remained a faithful correspondent and occasional visitor, traveling from Virginia at least twice a year to share updates on Miracle in person. The white mare had exceeded all expectations, her unique genetics contributing to a breeding program that had garnered international recognition. Miracle's offspring, each one carrying some trace of their mother's remarkable heritage, had been placed with carefully selected families around the world. But Miracle herself remained at Margaret's farm, living the peaceful life that Harold had been promised when he agreed to let her go. The photographs Margaret brought showed an animal thriving in her environment, her white coat still luminous against the green Virginia hills. The partnership arrangement between Harold and Margaret had proven more lucrative than either had anticipated. The fees from Miracle's breeding program provided the Mitchell family with a steady income that supplemented the farm's traditional operations. Harold had used some of this money to establish a scholarship fund for local students pursuing agricultural education, a way of giving back to the community that had supported him during his darkest hours. The first recipient had been the daughter of Thomas Walker, who was now studying veterinary medicine at the State University, with plans to return to Cedar Creek after graduation. Eleanor had passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 years after the Miracle birth, her body finally surrendering to the complications that had plagued her since the stroke. Harold had been devastated by her loss, the grief settling into his bones like a permanent ache that nothing could fully ease. But in his mourning, he found comfort in the knowledge that Eleanor had lived to see their farm saved, their family reunited, and their legacy secured. She had died knowing that their struggles had meaning, that their sacrifices had not been in vain. That knowledge, Harold believed, had allowed her to let go with grace. The story of Harold Mitchell and his Miracle foals had become something of a legend in Cedar Creek, told and retold until it had taken on the quality of folklore. Children who had not yet been born when Miracle and Hope entered the world grew up hearing about the bankrupt farmer who had risked his last $60 on a forgotten horse. The tale was shared at community gatherings and church functions, passed down from parents to children, as an example of what faith and determination could accomplish. Harold himself had become a local celebrity of sorts, though he deflected attention with the same humility that had characterized him throughout his life. On quiet evenings, Harold would sit on his porch and watch the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed to exist nowhere else on earth. He would think about his grandfather, who had cleared this land with nothing but strong hands and stronger will. He would think about his father, who had weathered the Great Depression without losing hope. He would think about Eleanor, whose love had sustained him through trials he could never have faced alone. And he would think about Grace, the forgotten mare who had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that miracles do not require grand gestures or perfect circumstances, only the willingness to believe when belief seems foolish. Sometimes his grandchildren would join him on that porch, their young voices full of questions about the horses and the farm and the story they had heard so many times but never tired of hearing. Harold would answer patiently, adding details he had forgotten in previous tellings, watching their eyes widen with wonder as the tale unfolded once more. In those moments, he understood that his true legacy was not the land or the animals or even the money that had saved them from ruin. His true legacy was this: the knowledge that hope is never wasted, that love is never foolish, and that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as burdens too heavy to bear. As darkness gathered and stars emerged one by one in the velvet sky, Harold would make his final walk of the day to the barn. There he would find Grace resting in her stall, Hope standing nearby with her own growing foal, 3 generations united in the place where everything had changed. He would speak to them softly, words meant only for their ears, before turning off the light and heading back to the house. Behind him, in the warm darkness of the barn, Grace would lift her head and watch him go, her eyes holding the same quiet understanding they had held since the very beginning. And in that moment, as it had been every night for 5 years, all was well on the Mitchell farm.